Tokyo, April 1943. The war room of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. Maps covered every wall, blue lines tracking convoys, red marks indicating losses. Commander Takeo Yoshikawa stood before them each morning, counting the ships that never returned. 17 merchant vessels in March alone. 23 the month before. The numbers climbed with a precision that felt less like war and more like execution. Yoshikawa was 41 years old, a career intelligence officer who had spent 2 decades studying American naval doctrine. He had gray at his temples now, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when the war began. He wore his uniform with the same discipline he always had, but something had changed in the way he carried himself, a heaviness in his shoulders, a hesitation before he spoke. The other officers called it exhaustion. He called it doubt. Every morning, he received the same reports: another convoy intercepted, another submarine ambushed, another transport sunk before it could reach its destination. The Americans were always in the right place. Always waiting. Always one step ahead. At first, it seemed like luck. The Pacific was vast, but not infinite. Coincidences happened. Then the coincidences became patterns. Yoshikawa had been trained to see patterns. It was his job to see them before anyone else did. And what he saw now, in the careful arrangement of losses on his maps, was something that made his stomach turn. The Americans knew. He couldn't prove it yet. He had no intercepted documents, no captured codebooks, no confession from a traitor. But the evidence was there, written in the blood of sailors who had trusted their communications were secure. Every major operation compromised. Every fleet movement anticipated. Every coded message seemingly read before the ink was dry. For months, Yoshikawa said nothing. He was not a man who spoke without evidence. The Imperial Navy did not reward speculation, and it certainly did not reward officers who suggested that Japan's most secure communications system had been compromised. To say such a thing without proof was to invite disgrace, or worse. So he watched. And he waited. And he built his case in silence. He began keeping a private ledger, a small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket, bound in worn leather. In it, he recorded every operation, every transmission, every loss. He noted the timing of American responses, the locations of their forces, the precision of their strikes. He cross-referenced transmission schedules with engagement reports. He mapped communication patterns against enemy movements. He looked for the thread that connected everything. His wife noticed the change in him. She would find him at his desk late at night, papers spread before him, his tea gone cold. She would ask if he was well, and he would smile and tell her he was fine, just tired. She stopped asking after a while. His colleagues noticed too. Yoshikawa had always been quiet, but now he was distant. He attended briefings but rarely spoke. He listened to operational plans with an expression that others couldn't quite read, not disagreement, exactly, but something close to resignation. Captain Hideaki Sato, his closest friend in the general staff, pulled him aside one afternoon in May. "You look like a man carrying a secret," Sato said. Yoshikawa glanced at him, then back at the maps on the wall. "We all carry secrets," he replied. "Some heavier than others." Yoshikawa said nothing. Sato studied him for a long moment, then lowered his voice. "If you know something, Takeo, you need to speak." "I know nothing," Yoshikawa said. "Not yet." But that wasn't quite true. He knew enough to be afraid. June 7, 1943. The report came in just after dawn. Operation Aro, a carefully planned submarine offensive targeting American supply lines near the Solomon Islands, had been a complete failure. All 6 submarines had been detected and engaged before they could reach their patrol zones. 2 were sunk. 3 were damaged and forced to retreat. 1 was missing, presumed lost. The operation had been planned in absolute secrecy. Only a handful of officers knew the details. The movement orders had been transmitted using the Navy's most secure cipher, JN-25, a code system that had been in use since 1939 and updated regularly to prevent compromise. Yoshikawa sat in the briefing room as Admiral Kondo read the casualty reports. Around the table, officers exchanged glances, their faces tight with frustration. "How did they know?" someone asked. No one answered. Yoshikawa opened his notebook. He had predicted this. Not the specifics, but the outcome. He had seen the pattern forming, had watched the pieces fall into place. And now, sitting in that room with the smell of defeat hanging in the air, he felt the weight of certainty settle over him like a stone. He raised his hand. Admiral Kondo looked at him. "Commander Yoshikawa?" Yoshikawa stood. His hands were steady, but his voice was quiet. "Sir, I believe our communications have been compromised." The room went silent. Kondo's expression didn't change. "Explain." Yoshikawa opened his notebook and began to speak. He laid out 6 months of data, operation after operation, loss after loss, pattern after pattern. He showed them the timing, the precision, the impossible consistency of American responses. He spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. When he finished, no one moved. Captain Sato was the first to speak. "You're suggesting the Americans have broken JN-25? "I'm suggesting," Yoshikawa said carefully, "that we must consider the possibility." Another officer, Commander Fujita, shook his head. "Impossible. JN-25 is unbreakable. We've updated it 17 times since the war began. The Americans don't have the resources. They sank our submarines before they reached their patrol zones," Yoshikawa interrupted. "They knew where they would be. They knew when they would be there. They were waiting." Fujita opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Admiral Kondo leaned back in his chair. His face was unreadable. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then every operation we've conducted for the past year has been compromised. Every plan, every movement, every strategy." "Yes, sir." "And you're only bringing this to my attention now?" Yoshikawa met his gaze. "I needed to be certain." "And are you?" "Certain?" Yoshikawa hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes, sir. I am." Admiral Kondo did not speak immediately. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded before him, his eyes fixed on the maps that covered the wall. Outside, the sounds of Tokyo filtered through the window, distant traffic, the call of vendors, the ordinary rhythm of a city that did not yet know how deeply the war had turned against it. Yoshikawa remained standing. His notebook was still open in his hands, pages filled with dates and coordinates and the careful arithmetic of defeat. He had spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing what he would say, how he would say it. But now that the words were out, he felt strangely empty. Around the table, the other officers sat in silence. Some stared at their papers. Others looked at Yoshikawa with expressions that ranged from skepticism to something closer to fear. Captain Sato was watching the admiral. Finally, Kondo spoke. "How long?" he asked. Yoshikawa understood the question. "I believe the compromise began sometime in late 1942. Possibly earlier." "Midway," someone whispered. The word hung in the air like smoke. Midway. The battle that was supposed to crush the American Pacific Fleet. The operation that had been planned with absolute precision, transmitted in code, executed with confidence. The operation that had ended in catastrophic defeat. 4 carriers lost. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Thousands of men dead. At the time, they had called it bad luck. Poor reconnaissance. American desperation leading to a miracle. But what if it hadn't been a miracle at all? What if the Americans had simply been reading their mail? Kondo's jaw tightened. He looked at Yoshikawa with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You're telling me," he said quietly, "that we have been fighting this war blind. That every decision we've made, every strategy we've employed, has been known to the enemy before we even executed it." "Yes, sir." "And you waited 6 months to tell me this." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Yoshikawa felt the weight of it, but he didn't look away. "I needed proof," he said. "Without proof, I had nothing but suspicion. And suspicion, sir, is not enough to accuse the entire communications division of failure. You have proof now?" "I have evidence. Statistical evidence. Pattern evidence. Enough to warrant a full investigation." Kondo stood. The movement was sudden, and it made several officers flinch. He walked to the wall, to the map of the Pacific, and stared at the red marks, each one a ship lost, a position compromised, a plan that had failed. "If this is true," he said, his voice low, "then we have been handing the Americans our strategy on a silver plate. We have been telling them where to find us, when to strike us, how to kill us." No one spoke. Kondo turned back to the table. His face was carved from stone. "Commander Yoshikawa, you will conduct a full audit of all JN-25 transmissions from the past 12 months. You will cross-reference every operation with enemy engagement reports. You will determine, with absolute certainty, whether this code has been compromised." "Yes, sir." "And you will do it quietly. If word of this spreads, it will cause panic. Do you understand?" "I understand." Kondo looked around the table. "This meeting is classified. No one speaks of this outside this room. Not to your staff, not to your families, not to anyone. If I discover that any of you have violated this order, I will personally see to your court-martial." He let the threat settle. Then he dismissed them. For the next 3 weeks, Yoshikawa barely slept. He requisitioned every communication log, every transmission record, every operational report from the past year. He worked in a small office on the 3rd floor of the Naval Ministry, a room with no windows and a single desk. A guard was posted outside. No one was allowed in without Kondo's direct authorization. He read until his eyes burned. He cross-referenced until the numbers blurred together. He built timelines, drew connections, mapped patterns. And with every page he turned, the picture became clearer. The Americans weren't just reading JN-25. They were reading it in real time. They were decrypting messages within hours of transmission, sometimes faster. They were using that intelligence to position their forces, to set ambushes, to strike with surgical precision. Midway hadn't been luck. The Solomon Islands hadn't been coincidence. Operation RO hadn't been a failure of tactics. It had all been inevitable. Because the Americans had known. They had always known. Yoshikawa documented everything. He created charts showing the correlation between transmissions and enemy actions. He calculated probability distributions, demonstrating that the consistency of American responses was statistically impossible without access to Japanese communications. He built an irrefutable case. But as the evidence mounted, so did his dread. Because if JN-25 was compromised, then so was everything else. Every strategic decision made in the past year had been based on the assumption that their communications were secure. Every operational plan had been transmitted in code, believing it was safe. They had been wrong. And the cost of that mistake was written in the blood of thousands. One night, late in June, Captain Sato came to visit him. The guard let him in without question. Sato was one of the few officers cleared to enter. He found Yoshikawa at his desk, surrounded by papers, his uniform jacket draped over the back of his chair. "You look terrible," Sato said. Yoshikawa glanced up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. "I feel worse." Sato pulled up a chair and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sato said, "Have you found what you were looking for?" Yoshikawa nodded slowly. "And? We've been compromised. Completely. JN-25, JN-11, possibly others. The Americans have been reading our communications for over a year." Sato closed his eyes. "God help us." "God isn't listening," Yoshikawa said quietly. Sato looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now I finish the report. I present it to Admiral Kondo. And then he trailed off. And then what? Yoshikawa leaned back in his chair. He looked exhausted. And then we admit that we've been losing this war not because the Americans are stronger, but because we handed them the keys to every door we tried to lock. July 2nd, 1943. Yoshikawa delivered his report to Admiral Kondo in a sealed envelope. It was 73 pages long. Kondo read it in silence, alone in his office, while Yoshikawa waited outside. 2 hours passed. When the door finally opened, Kondo's face was ashen. "Come in," he said. Yoshikawa entered. The report was on the desk, pages spread out like an autopsy. Kondo gestured to a chair. "Sit." Yoshikawa sat. Kondo poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. He handed one to Yoshikawa. "I don't usually drink during the day," Kondo said. "Neither do I, sir." They drank in silence. Then Kondo said, "Your report is conclusive." "Yes, sir." "There is no doubt." "None." Kondo set his glass down. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. Older and tired and something else, something Yoshikawa recognized because he felt it too. Defeated. "I will present this to the Naval General Staff tomorrow," Kondo said. "They will convene an emergency meeting. Changes will be made. New codes will be implemented. Protocols will be revised." "Yes, sir." "But it won't matter, will it?" Yoshikawa looked at him. "Sir? The damage is done. The Americans know our doctrine, our tactics, our thinking. Even if we change the codes, they've already learned how we operate. They've been inside our heads for a year." Yoshikawa said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Kondo picked up the report and stared at it. "Do you know what this means, Commander?" "Yes, sir. It means every man who died in the past year died because we were careless. Because we believed ourselves invincible. Because we thought our codes were unbreakable and our enemy was inferior." He looked at Yoshikawa. "It means we were fools." July 3rd, 1943. The emergency meeting of the Naval General Staff was held in a windowless conference room deep within the Ministry building. 16 officers attended. No aides. No secretaries. No record was kept. Admiral Kondo presented Yoshikawa's findings himself. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, head of the operations section, was the first to speak. His voice was carefully controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Commander Yoshikawa's analysis is troubling. But I must ask, is it possible that these patterns are simply the result of improved American intelligence gathering? Radio direction finding, reconnaissance aircraft, captured documents?" Yoshikawa had expected this. He stood and walked to the front of the room, where a large chart had been mounted on an easel. "Sir, I consider that possibility. But the precision of American responses exceeds what any conventional intelligence method could provide. For example," he pointed to a series of entries on the chart. "On May 12th, we transmitted movement orders for submarine I-17 at 0400 hours. The submarine was to patrol a specific grid reference in the Coral Sea, arriving on May 16th. On May 15th, American destroyers were already in position at that exact location. They engaged I-17 within 2 hours of its arrival." He moved to another entry. "On May 28th, we transmitted revised patrol routes for 3 submarines operating near Guadalcanal. The transmissions were sent at 2200 hours. By dawn the next morning, American aircraft had located and attacked all 3 vessels along their new routes that had been changed less than 12 hours earlier." He turned back to face the room. "This is not reconnaissance, sir. This is foreknowledge. They are reading our transmissions." Fukudome's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Admiral Kondo stood. "The evidence is irrefutable. JN-25 has been compromised. The question now is not whether this has happened, but what we do about it. Captain Jiro Nomura, the senior cryptography officer, cleared his throat. He looked pale. We can implement JN25D immediately. It's a complete revision of the codebook, new cipher tables, new additives, new procedures. It will take the Americans months to break it, if they can break it at all. How long to implement? Kondo asked. 3 weeks for full fleet distribution. 3 weeks during which we continue to operate with compromised communications. Nomura nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. Another officer spoke up, Commander Masao Tarachi, a logistics specialist. What about ongoing operations? We have convoys at sea, submarines on patrol, fleet movements already in progress. If we change codes now, we'll create chaos. Ships won't be able to communicate with headquarters. Coordination will break down. And if we don't change codes, Kondo said quietly, those ships will continue to be slaughtered. The room fell silent again. Yoshikawa watched them struggle with the reality he had been living with for months. The impossible choice between operational chaos and operational suicide. Finally, Admiral Manaichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, spoke. He was a man known for his calm demeanor, but now his voice carried a weight that made everyone sit straighter. Gentlemen, we are not discussing a tactical problem. We are discussing a strategic catastrophe. If the Americans have been reading our communications for a year, then they know everything. Our fleet dispositions. Our supply routes. Our operational doctrine. Our strategic objectives. He paused. They know how we think. The words settled over the room like ash. Koga continued. Changing the code will help. But it will not undo the damage. The Americans have spent a year studying us, learning our patterns, understanding our decision-making processes. Even with new codes, they will anticipate our moves because they have seen how we operate. Then what do you suggest, sir? Fukudome asked. Koga looked at him. We change everything. Not just the codes. Everything. We revise our operational procedures. We alter our tactical doctrine. We become unpredictable. That will take months, someone said. Then we have months of vulnerability ahead of us, Koga replied. But the alternative is to continue as we are, and that is not acceptable. He turned to Yoshikawa. Commander, your analysis has done this nation a service. You have identified a wound that was bleeding us dry. But now comes the harder part, we must learn to fight differently. We must assume that everything we have done until now has been observed and catalogued by the enemy. We must become a different navy. Yoshikawa bowed his head. Yes, sir. The meeting ended an hour later with a series of directives. JN25D would be implemented immediately, with emergency distribution to all fleet units. All ongoing operations would be reviewed and, where possible, modified or cancelled. A complete revision of operational procedures would begin within the week. And most importantly, absolute silence. No one outside that room was to know the full extent of the compromise. The official explanation would be routine code updates for security purposes. Yoshikawa left the building just after sunset. The streets of Tokyo were quiet, the city settling into evening. He walked slowly, his briefcase in one hand, his mind elsewhere. He thought about the sailors who had died because of messages they believed were secret. He thought about the pilots who had flown into ambushes because their orders had been read before they received them. He thought about all the small decisions, the careful plans, the strategic brilliance that had meant nothing because the enemy had known every move before it was made. Captain Sato caught up with him 2 blocks from the ministry. Takeo. Yoshikawa stopped and turned. Sato looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, respect, maybe, or pity, or both. You did the right thing, Sato said. Yoshikawa shook his head slowly. I did the necessary thing. That's not the same. It took courage. It took 6 months of watching men die before I was willing to speak. That's not courage. That's cowardice with a delayed reaction. Sato stepped closer. You couldn't have known for certain until you had the evidence. You did what any good officer would do, you investigated before you accused. And how many men died while I was investigating? Sato had no answer for that. They stood in silence for a moment, two officers in the fading light, carrying the weight of knowledge that could not be shared. Finally, Sato said, "What will you do now?" Yoshikawa looked up at the sky. It was clear, stars beginning to emerge. "I'll go home. I'll have dinner with my wife. I'll pretend that everything is normal. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll help them build a new system. New codes, new procedures, new ways of thinking. And I'll hope it's enough." "Do you think it will be?" Yoshikawa was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I don't think it will be. The Americans have had a year to study us. They know our doctrine, our tactics, our patterns. Changing the code won't change that. We've given them a window into our soul, and you can't close a window after someone has already seen inside." He looked at Sato. "We've lost something more than security. We've lost the element of surprise. We've lost the ability to be unpredictable. And in war, that's everything." August 15th, 1943. 6 weeks after the emergency meeting. Yoshikawa sat in his office, reviewing the first reports from fleet units using the new JN-25D code system. The implementation had been chaotic, missed communications, delayed orders, confusion in the field. But it was done. The Americans would have to start over. Or so they hoped. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." It was a young ensign, carrying a dispatch folder marked urgent. "Sir, this just came from the Solomon Islands. Admiral Koga requested you see it immediately." Yoshikawa took the folder and opened it. Inside was a battle report from August 6th. A Japanese convoy had been intercepted by American forces near Vella La Vella. 3 transports sunk. 2 destroyers damaged. Heavy casualties. The convoy's route had been transmitted using JN-25D. The new, supposedly secure code. Yoshikawa read the report twice, his hands steady but his mind racing. The ensign shifted nervously. "Sir? Is there a response?" Yoshikawa looked up at him. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Tell Admiral Koga I'll have a full analysis on his desk by morning." "Yes, sir." The ensign left. Yoshikawa sat alone in his office, the report in front of him, the implications spreading through his mind like cracks in ice. They had changed the code. They had revised procedures. They had done everything right. And the Americans had still been waiting. He thought about what Admiral Koga had said, "They know how we think." And he realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that changing the code had never been enough. The Americans didn't just have their messages. They had their patterns. Their doctrine. Their strategic philosophy. They had spent a year inside Japan's decision-making process, watching how plans were formed, how operations were executed, how commanders thought. And that knowledge didn't disappear when the code changed. Yoshikawa closed his eyes. He thought about all the meetings, all the debates, all the careful analysis that had led to this moment. He thought about the officers who believed that new codes would solve the problem, that security could be restored with better procedures. He thought about how wrong they all were. Because the truth he was only now fully understanding, was that the damage wasn't in the code. It was in the mind. The Americans had learned to think like them. And you couldn't encrypt that away. September 1943. Yoshikawa requested a private meeting with Admiral Kondo. They met in Kondo's office, late in the evening, when the ministry was quiet. Kondo poured tea. They sat across from each other, the desk between them. "You've been reviewing the August intercepts," Kondo said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And?" Yoshikawa set down his cup. "The Americans are still anticipating our movements. Not with the same precision as before, but close enough. They're adapting to JN-25D faster than we predicted. Kondo nodded slowly. I've seen the same reports. Sir, I don't think it's just the code anymore. Explain. Yoshikawa chose his words carefully. When we changed to JN-25D, we assumed it would buy us time. That the Americans would need months to break the new system. But what if they don't need to break it? What if they've already learned enough about our operational patterns that they can predict our moves without reading our messages? Kondo was silent for a moment. You're saying they've learned to think like us? Yes, sir. Then how do we fight that? We stop thinking like ourselves. Kondo raised an eyebrow. That's not a strategy, Commander. That's philosophy. With respect, sir, it's the only strategy we have left. We've spent decades developing our naval doctrine. It's efficient, it's logical, it's based on sound principles. But it's also predictable. The Americans have studied it. They know what we'll do before we do it. So we abandon everything we've built? No, sir. We evolve. We introduce randomness. We make decisions that don't follow our established patterns. We become unpredictable, even if it costs us efficiency. Kondo leaned back in his chair. He looked tired. Do you know what you're asking? You're asking the Imperial Navy to fight against its own nature. To abandon the discipline and structure that made us strong. I'm asking us to survive, sir. The words hung in the air. Kondo stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window. Outside, Tokyo stretched into the darkness, a city that still believed victory was possible. When this war began, Kondo said quietly, we believed we were superior. Better trained, better disciplined, better prepared. We believed our codes were unbreakable and our strategies were sound. He turned back to Yoshikawa. We were wrong about the codes. And now you're telling me we were wrong about everything else too. Yes, sir. Kondo returned to his desk. He sat down heavily. I'll present your recommendations to the General Staff. But I can't promise they'll listen. Changing tactics is one thing. Changing the fundamental nature of how we wage war, that's something else entirely. I understand, sir. Kondo looked at him with something that might have been respect, or might have been sorrow. You've carried a heavy burden these past months, Commander. You saw the truth before anyone else was willing to look. That takes strength. It doesn't feel like strength, sir. It never does. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Yoshikawa stood. Permission to return to my duties, sir? Granted. Yoshikawa bowed and turned to leave. Commander. He stopped. Thank you, Kondo said. For having the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. Yoshikawa nodded once, then left. October 1943. Yoshikawa stood in his office, looking at the maps on his wall. The red marks had multiplied. More ships lost. More operations compromised. More men dead. JN-25D had helped, but not enough. The Americans were still winning. Because they had learned the one lesson that mattered, how Japan fought. And that knowledge, once gained, could not be taken back. Yoshikawa thought about the moment in Admiral Kondo's office, 6 weeks ago, when he had finally understood the full scope of what had been lost. Not just security. Not just tactical advantage. But predictability itself. The Americans had spent a year watching Japan make decisions. They had seen the patterns, learned the doctrine, understood the thinking. And even now, with new codes and revised procedures, those patterns remained. Because patterns weren't in the messages. They were in the minds of the men who sent them. Yoshikawa picked up his pen and began writing his daily report. The numbers were grim, as always. But he wrote them down with the same precision he always had, because that was his duty. And because, in the end, knowing the truth changed nothing. The war would continue. Men would die. And somewhere in the Pacific, American cryptanalysts would sit at their desks, reading messages they weren't supposed to understand, anticipating moves they weren't supposed to predict. Because Japan had given them a gift. Not just broken codes, but broken certainty. And that was something that could never be encrypted away. Yoshikawa set down his pen. Outside his window, Tokyo continued its evening rhythm, unaware. He thought about his wife, waiting for him at home. He thought about the sailors at sea, trusting their communications were secure. He thought about all the small moments of faith that held a nation together during war. And he thought about the silence that follows revelation, the heavy, unchangeable silence of knowing that everything you believed was wrong. He closed his notebook. Tomorrow, he would write another report. And the day after that, another. And the Americans would keep reading. And the war would go on. But something had shifted. Not in the codes or the procedures or the tactics. In him. He had learned that certainty was an illusion. That security was temporary. That the enemy you underestimate is the one who learns your secrets. And he had learned that the moment you realize you've been fighting blind is not the moment you lose. It's the moment you realize you've already lost. And all that remains is deciding how to carry that knowledge forward. Yoshikawa put on his jacket, turned off the light, and walked out into the Tokyo night. Behind him, the maps remained on the wall. The red marks multiplying. Silent witnesses to the war that was, and the war that would be.